One of my friends once described what it was like to go from being a loader to being a gunner in a tank. He and I had done the same thing. When you're loading, you do not know what you're shooting at. You have no idea what you're firing at. All you do is keep slamming shells into the main gun and putting 30 caliber machine gun bullets into the machine gun. But when you move from that seat over into the gunner's seat, you have the crosshairs, and the first time you have to pull that trigger or step on the trigger in Sherman, you know you're going to kill somebody, and it is not easy. But after you have done that a few times and they have shot back and you have lost the tank, then it becomes a different story altogether. I had been to a movie that day with my best friend. We came home and his father, who was a doctor, had this look on his face and we wondered what was going on. He said, "Pearl Harbor has been attacked and we will be at war." At that point, we were still in high school. When we got out of school, we all got jobs right away. We were registered and waiting to be called to be drafted. None of my friends had been drafted by January of the next year. And that is when, being so smart, I thought surely they would go in the next group. So I went down and volunteered for the draft, went to the draft board, and volunteered to go with the next bunch. I did, and they did not, and so they all came later. I received a notice to report at the train station in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I was transported from there to Fort Hays in Columbus. I spent the first night in civilian clothes, and then the next day, they took us over, gave us a box, we wrote our home address on it, and put all of our clothes in the box, and off they went. There I stood with about 100 or so naked men, and we started through the process of getting into the service. We had to give the usual urine sample, then we got shots, then we had to be fitted for shoes and clothes, and after that I was officially in military. When I went into the service, the job I had held as a civilian was driving a truck for Royal Crown, and my father's advice to me was, do not tell them you are a truck driver. Tell them you are a student. Maybe they will send you to school. So I said, okay. When I wanted to be designated for where I was going to go, I said, I do not want anything with a steering wheel because the officer already had my record that I was a truck driver. He said, okay, and he gave me a ticket to where I was to go. I got out, got on the truck, and they dropped me off. The first person I ran into, I asked, what kind of unit is this? And he said, it is tanks, and I said, oh boy. I still think that officer who assigned me, there is probably still laughing that he did not give me something with steering wheels, because the tanks had levers. At that point, I was assigned to Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 80th Armored Regiment of the 8th Armored Division. A Sherman tank was laid out in two main parts, the hull and the turret. Down in front on the left-hand side was the driver, and on the right-hand side down in the hull was the bow gunner. They sometimes called him the loader or assistant driver, although he never really could have driven because he did not have any of the driving controls. He was really the bow gunner because he had a 30 caliber machine gun. Up in the turret on the left-hand side was the loader for the main gun, and on the right-hand side in the front was the gunner. Standing behind the gunner was the tank commander. Those tanks all had 5-man crews. It was crowded, that is for sure. There was a very minimal amount of space, but we were all young and agile and managed to move around and do our jobs. When we went into combat, you could not get out of the tank at night, so we had a lot of blankets, and you would just run a blanket up against some place on the side and lean up against that. As I said, we were young, and we could finally get comfortable and sleep, but there was not much room to move around. In a Sherman tank, in all the ones that I served in, there was a hatch for the driver and one for the bow gunner. And on the turret, there was only one hatch over on the right-hand side. That was where the tank commander stood up so he could look out and search for targets or whatever needed to be seen, and that was the only hatch in the turret. If you wanted to get out of the tank in a hurry, the tank commander got out first, then the gunner, and the loader was third because he had to crawl underneath the recoil guard on the cannon before he could get out. There was one other emergency exit on this tank, underneath the bow gunner's seat. One of my stories about that is that we were brought back to a rest area off the front line, and we decided to make ourselves a little hideout. We drove the tank back and forth a few times to make good, deep track marks, then took shovels and dug down about 18 inches in the middle of those tracks. We put a tarp down on the bottom, then pulled the tank back over the spot. The idea was to have a place where we could climb down, play cards, smoke, have some light, and not have to worry about being shot at or hit with artillery or mortars. But when we went to open that escape hatch underneath the bow gunner's seat, it was frozen shut with rust because the tank was old. We finally managed to find a hammer somewhere and beat it open so we could get out, but that was the only other exit. It was very tight, maybe 16 to 18 inches from the bottom of that hatch to the ground. Since we were young, we could slide out of there. I never actually did, but you could if you had to. As for ammunition, I should know the exact numbers, but I really do not. The ammunition for the main gun came in 3 categories: armor-piercing, high explosive, and a smoke or white phosphorus shell. We only had, as I remember it, maybe one of those phosphorus shells on board. We had a lot of 30 caliber machine gun ammunition, those long belts you fed into the gun. You would put the belt in, slam the lid down once, and it was ready to go. The bow gunner had ammunition stored down in his position that he could pass up into the turret. That was one of his extra duties. In the tanks I served in during combat, the bow gunner almost never actually fired his 30 caliber machine gun. The gun sat low, around belt level, while his periscope was up at eye level. Every 5th round in a 30 caliber belt is a tracer, so you can see where you're shooting, but it is not very accurate if you're looking up here and shooting down there. On top of that, he rarely had a clear target. Most of the time, he was busy handing up ammunition to the loader. When I went overseas, I landed on D-Day. I crossed on the Queen Elizabeth, and on D-Day we docked at the Firth of Clyde in Scotland. The next day, I was moved down to the town of Wells in Somerset County, and I stayed there for about 3 weeks. Then all of us replacements were taken down to Portsmouth, where we waited about another week. By the time I got to France, it was about a month after D-Day. We moved around France, skirted around Paris, and that was when I was finally assigned to a tank as a loader. I should emphasize that the loader did not have his own hatch to get out of. The only way I could see outside the tank was through a small periscope I could rotate left and right and tilt up and down. My view of the world was very limited, and usually when we got into a battle, I did not have much time to look anyway. I had to be ready to grab whatever kind of ammunition the tank commander called for and get it into the breech as quickly as possible. The 4 men already in that tank had been in combat for a while. They had been through some tough fighting. How much, I do not know because they never talked about it. I never asked why they needed a new loader or what had happened to the man I replaced, and they never said. That was just my assignment. I was the loader, and I did the loader's job, and from there we went on. We had a few short skirmishes at first. Then one night we drove almost all night, and by the next morning, along with the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and some other units, we surrounded Mons, Belgium, and captured a very large number of German troops. After Mons, we moved forward and headed for the Siegfried Line. The fighting at that point was relatively light, at least for the group I was with. We had gotten behind the Germans, which was exactly what the army wanted, because if we left them there for the French underground and the French Liberation Forces would take care of them. If we reached the Siegfried Line before the Germans did, they could not get back in there to defend their homeland. The first German I had any real contact with was a young boy who could not have been more than 14 or 15, just a few years younger than I was. He was a prisoner, sitting on the front of a Jeep, holding his crucifix and shaking, absolutely terrified. I wanted to tell him, "Do not worry, we are not going to shoot you. We are going to feed you and put you in a prison camp," but I did not speak a word of German. Once we got into combat, it was a completely different story. They had years of experience, and in some ways we were still learning how to fight a war. I grew to dislike them intensely at that point. I was determined to do my part of the job. When I became a gunner, one of my friends described perfectly what it feels like to go from being a loader to being a gunner in a tank, and he and I had gone through the same thing. When you're loading, you do not know what you're shooting at. You have no idea what you're firing at. All you do is keep slamming shells into the breech, feeding 30 caliber machine gun belts into the guns, doing the mechanical work. You're not the one making the decision to fire. But when you move from that seat over into the gunner's seat, you have the crosshairs in front of you. And the first time you have to pull that trigger or step on the trigger pedal in a Sherman, you know you're going to kill somebody. It is not easy the first time. After you have done that a few times and they have shot back and you have lost a tank, it becomes a different story. They asked me once about the first time I was wounded. It happened in that first tank. When it was hit, the shell struck at about the level of the gunner, who was standing here, and the tank commander, who was standing just above and slightly behind. The round went straight through the gunner's midsection and then right through the tank commander's midsection. They were both killed instantly. The gunner fell backward, and the tank commander fell down the other way. And there I was with no exit through my own hatch. I had to crawl underneath the recoil guard to get out, and their bodies were blocking my way. I was trying desperately to pull these 2 dead men apart, but I could not move them. Out of the corner of my eye saw daylight, because the driver had already gotten out. I dropped down from the turret into the hull, then climbed out of the tank and dove over the side. When you get out a knocked out tank like that, you're out there with no helmet, no rifle, nothing, right on the front line. You are a target, and you do not want to be a standing target, so you move. I hit the ground and started to run. The driver and the bow gunner were up on the side of a bank, and they shouted to me, asking about the lieutenant and Reevy. I shook my head, and then I started to run again. My foot caught on a root or something. I tripped, and down I went. My shoulder came out of joint. I put it back in, and when I did, I noticed that my leg was bleeding. There was a light tank nearby, so I ran over to it and yelled for a bandage. The tank commander told me to come up and get it. His hand came out of the hatch with a bandage, and I climbed up the side of the tank. Just as I was getting up there, a German fired at me with a submachine gun. I turned quickly, spotted him, and shouted his position to the light tank commander. He swung his gun around and fired, and that took care of the German. Then I put the bandage on my leg and carried on. I was looking for a place I thought was better than just standing out there in the open, and I saw a half-dug foxhole, so I ran for that. About that time, a medic came by and said, "Can you walk?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, go up through there, through that opening. There's a half-track back there," and I did that. I got in the half-track. There were 3 of us sitting on one side and 1 really badly wounded infantryman on the other side. They took us back to the field hospital and treated my leg. They gave me the standard injection they always did, the kind that makes your arm hurt worse than your leg does. Then I went outside. They had a tent set up there with cots, and I stayed overnight. The next day, I got a ride back up to the company command post. The first sergeant was standing there and said, "What are you doing here?" I said the tank got lost and got hit. He said, "Anybody get hurt?" I said, "Yes, Lieutenant Rand did." He said, "Oh, well, just take it easy. Just lie down, take it easy." This was September 17th and 18th, and I just laid down in the grass to rest. It was warm, and after a while here comes the first sergeant again. He said, "Walter, we have a chance to get another tank from Ordnance. I'm going to send you back. You will be the tank commander. I will get you a driver, and you just bring the tank up here." I said, "Okay." So we went down in the Jeep, got the tank, and the driver drove while I stood up in the tank commander's position. We came back, just the 2 of us, up to company headquarters, to the command post, and the first sergeant came up and said, "Walter, I hate to do this to you, but you know how badly they need tanks." I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "Okay, you are the gunner now." So I got the gunner's position, and we had the driver and the bow gunner who had gotten out over there before, Sergeant Jones, who had been ordered out earlier. He was there. So the 4 of us who had been in that tank the day before when it was shot and blown up were right back the next day. Within 24 hours, we were back up on the front line. When we got into the Battle of the Bulge, we were fighting Colonel Paper's Schutzstaffel, the SS troopers, and they were under orders not to take prisoners because they could not feed them, they could not take care of them, and prisoners would slow them down. Word came down to us that they were not taking prisoners, and from then on it was really a fight. It was them or us. My tank and our task force switched around and started driving to relieve the men later known as the Band of Brothers. I was in the 5th tank in the column. My tank commander was low in rank compared to the others, so he was further back. As we turned a corner and started down a road that went downhill, we came to a T intersection, and there was a German column going by in front of us. The lead tank commander, a lieutenant named Hope, ordered a high explosive shell loaded into the main gun and told the driver to speed up downhill. The driver went downhill as fast as he could and turned the corner. The last vehicle in that German column was either a tank or a truck pulling an anti-tank gun, one of those German 88mm guns that could shoot at airplanes or be used as artillery. It took time for their crew to get out of the truck, get around to the gun, get the ammunition out of the truck and load the weapon, and by that time, it was too late. Our first tank came around the corner, hit the gun and the men who were there, and then put another round into the truck. That started the truck blowing up. It was like the 4th of July. We had to stop and wait while it burned. We waited at least half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then they said, "Let's try going around." The first tank went up close to the truck, down into the ditch, and up again, and away it went. Inside the tank, you had 2 options for turning the turret. One option was to do it by hand, which was fairly fast. The other option was to flip a little switch and turn it electrically. Just move a handle and the turret would go. That electric system was a little slower, but it worked. When we were going down the road, I had the electric turret control turn on, and when we stopped and waited, it was noisy, really noisy, so I shut it off. At the start of it all, we went down into the ditch to go around a truck. I had forgotten that I had turned the gun off and left it loose, so when we dropped into the ditch, the gun swung around and the barrel stuck in the bank. We had to back up, get back up onto the road, and then get out to check the gun and make sure there was no dirt in the barrel. Once we had done that, we took off to catch up with the German column and to rejoin our other 4 tanks. When we got down into the village, the first 4 tanks had already gone under a railroad underpass. On the other side, the Germans had decided they had enough time to get set up, and they were good fighters. They had been fighting for years. They assumed those 4 tanks were all there were, and they picked them all off and killed Lieutenant Hope. It was his first day in combat, which was tragic. My tank stopped short. We did not go under the underpass. Instead, we joined up with the next 5 tanks that came along and fell into their platoon. That was when the decision was made that we would go south and meet General Patton's troops coming up from the other direction to relieve Bastogne. We started moving south, taking a different village almost every day. On the last day that I was in combat, we pulled into a village called Frere, or something like that in French. I am not sure of the exact name. My tank was again the 5th tank in the column. We came out of the woods, followed the road, and crossed an open field. The tank commander was listening on the radio to what was happening in town with the tank ahead of us in our platoon. He ordered me to put a shell into the upper story of a Belgian house, which I did, and then he told the driver to pull the tank right up next to the house, under a window. He threw a hand grenade into the 2nd story, which chased a German soldier out the front. We shot him as he came out. Then we pulled away from the house, crossed the road, went up over a little stone fence, and moved out into the field. The infantry started taking small arms fire from another house farther down, so the tank commander ordered me to swing the gun around toward it, and I did. About that time, a German soldier stood up with a Panzerfaust, a bazooka-like anti-tank weapon, and fired. He missed our tank, but there were infantrymen standing nearby, and several of them were hit. Some took shrapnel in their legs. One man had a chunk of flesh torn out of his nose and bled heavily. The commander then called for gun left, and I brought the gun around. I was looking through the periscope, and I could see the German off to one side, but I could not traverse the gun far enough to get the crosshairs on him. He fired a 2nd shot, and this one hit. I was leaning far forward over the controls, concentrating on my gunnery, when the shell struck right behind my head. All the force of the blast went backward. It killed the tank commander instantly. He slammed his fist into my back as he died, and then fell onto me before slumping down into the tank. The driver was out, the gunner was out, the loader was out, and with the tank commander dead, there was no one left in command. I climbed out of the tank, and my loader came out behind me. We jumped down while still taking small arms fire from several houses farther down the road. I yelled at the infantrymen to clear that house, and we all ran back into it together. Once inside, I shouted at them again to get away from the windows. I have laughed about that ever since because I was only a corporal, and that was the only time I ever really got to pull rank on anybody, yelling at those infantrymen to get into the house and out of the line of fire. We passed each other up, helping each other, and once we were done putting bandages on each other, I realized that my head felt cold. I reached up to touch my head, and when my hand came back, it was covered in blood. I turned to the young kid standing next to me and asked him what was going on with my head. He looked at it and said it did not look too bad, just that it was bleeding. I told him that if it was bleeding that much, I had better go see the medics. That same kid had a leg wound that was bleeding badly, and we had already bandaged him up as best we could in the field. We had an open field to cross to get to a safer spot, so I told him to climb onto my back. I carried him piggyback across that field until we reached the road and slipped into the edge of the woods where we were less likely to be shot at. We were standing there catching our breath when a Jeep came up the road. In the Jeep was a major who had also been shot. They stopped, pulled us aboard, and drove us to the nearest aid station before racing off again to pick up more wounded. Inside the aid station, the kid with the bleeding leg sat down in a chair, and I sat on the floor beside him, feeling the pounding in my head. That first stop was a triage center. The doctor there had to make quick decisions about who he could save, what immediate care he could give, and who had to be sent on. While we were waiting, the door opened and an ambulance driver asked the doctor if he had room for one more patient. The doctor looked around the room. His eyes moved over the serious cases on the cots and finally settled on me. He pointed and said, "You go with him." I protested and said that the boy was bleeding very badly from his leg, but the doctor repeated more firmly that I was to go. That was the end of the discussion. I climbed into the ambulance, and they rushed me to a field hospital. There they sat me down under the bright lights and began pulling pieces of steel shrapnel out of my head, dropping each fragment into a metal pan. I asked the doctor if I could have one piece as a souvenir. He said yes and handed one to me. I slipped it into my pocket and lay still while they finished picking fragments out of my scalp, cleaned the wounds, and put dressings and medication on them. When they were done, they told me to go into the next room, find an empty cot, lie down, and take it easy for a while. That room held 4 or 5 of us, all wounded but still able to walk. We were not in good shape, but we were not hurt badly enough to be kept flat on our backs. The idea was simple. If you were still ambulatory, sooner or later you were going to be sent back to your unit. We stretched out on the cots, grateful just to be in a warm place with a roof over our heads and out of the line of fire, and we let ourselves relax for the first time in hours. Just as we were starting to enjoy that small bit of comfort, a sergeant came into the room and ordered us outside and into the truck. We groaned and protested that we were wounded, but he did not care. We climbed into the truck, and they hauled us back up the line to our companies. I spent that night with my unit, but the next night, I was up the entire time with terrible diarrhea, weak and dehydrated from everything my body had been through. The following morning, the first sergeant came over to me and said he was going to send me up this time as a tank commander. I told him straight out that I did not want to be a tank commander. He said I would be a sergeant right away. I answered that I had already had 5 tank commanders and that I wanted to stay as the gunner. He looked at me for a moment, then finally agreed and dropped the subject. He added that breakfast was ready. When I tried to sit up to go eat, everything went black and I passed out completely drained. When I came around, my legs were so weak and shaky that I could barely stand. The sergeant watched me try to get up and finally called the medics again. They took me across the street to a Belgian house where an elderly woman lived. She was so kind that I felt I could have stayed there forever. She brought up a warm brick from the stove, wrapped it, and put it down by my feet to warm them. During the Battle of the Bulge, it was bitterly cold, with snow on the ground all around us, and that simple warm brick at my feet felt like absolute heaven. Before long, an ambulance arrived, and they took me back to Liège. There, someone finally decided that I had been through enough combat for one man. They sent me on to Paris, then back to the coast, and from there I was put on a ship and sent back to England. I spent the rest of my time overseas with the 95th Bomb Group. When I think about my military service, I do not usually think in terms of pride, medals, or glory. I think of the men I served with, especially those who did not come home. If I am proud of anything, it is simply that I did what I was called to do as a tank gunner, performing the job I was given as well as I could. I did my part, I stayed with my crew, and I kept going as long as I was asked. That, more than anything else, is what my service means to me.